each mass medium is like an environment. Marshall McLuhan, when he said, "The medium is the message," and everybody went, yeah, right, yeah, no one understands what he's saying. Except what he was saying was something really brilliant. Think about it for a second. The medium is the message. How does a message change when it goes from newspaper to radio to television to the internet? In each case, it's the same message, but it's presented very differently. You may say, so what, Donna? What's this got to do with your talk? Well, actually everything, because the time period you asked me to speak about, the time of the Molasses flood, is a time when society is changing tremendously and the media are changing tremendously. Up until 1919, if you wanted to know anything, how did you find it out? You waited for the newspaper to come out. Whitman had a newspaper. It was a weekly. That's not unusual. A lot of small towns and smaller cities had a weekly, okay? The Whitman Times. It was actually kind of an interesting little paper. It was in 1919, 1920. It's owned by a guy named Samuel Burley and his wife, Dessa. And Samuel's the publisher. Dessa is one of the reporters. And that's very unusual back then. The culture is still negotiating what to do with women who have just gotten the vote in 1920. Except it's sort of a misnomer to say women got the vote in 1920. The truth is, in a number of states, women already had the vote. I teach, I'm a professor at Lesley University. I was at Emerson before that. And I always ask my students, okay, in 1917, the first woman elected to Congress took her seat. Her name was Jeannette Rankin. Women didn't have the vote yet. How did she do it? And of course, people stare blankly up at me because, you know. But it's actually not a trick question. When people think women got the vote, they forget that that was kind of the federal vote and it kind of normalized voting all across the United States. But in Colorado, for example, women had the vote in 1893, okay? And in Montana, where Jeannette Rankin was elected from, they also had the vote way before the federal caught up with it. So the reality was that there were women who were already getting into politics, coming into the public sphere, and they're all doing that around 1919, 1920. Most of them are not reporting for newspapers, though. The newspapers are still kind of stuck in the model of anything that women do, it's on the women's page, which means cooking, recipes, fashion, except we know there were some war reporters. There was a woman named Peggy Hull who reported on World War I for the newspapers, but she was kind of the exception. And back then it wasn't called World War I because, yeah, nobody knew there was going to be a World War II. Yeah, my students are all puzzled by that. It's kind of like, we looked for a world. Yeah, well, the reality is, first of all, not everything is on Google. And second of all, there are some things to be said for going back to the old microfilm or going back to the original copies. On this table, I have some rare memorabilia that goes all the way back to that period of time. We'll stay on women for about 1 second, though, because I was just fascinated. Every time I do a talk, I always try to localize it. And when I was doing my research on Whitman, I was fascinated to find out about Dessa Burley. It's like, wow, you know, she was not only, you know, the wife of the publisher, she went out and reported, and she ultimately became the editor. And I thought that was kind of cool because, again, it was sort of unusual. But in that period, all sorts of things were being negotiated. So we're moving from a time of newspaper reporting and magazine reporting to a new mass medium, radio. And if McLuhan is right, and I believe he is, and the medium is the message, how does the message change from being represented in newspaper to being represented on the radio? I'll talk about that in a couple of minutes. But first, let me show you the place where everything was happening. This is Newspaper Row. Every city had one. Back in those days, at the turn of the century, 1900 to about 1920, that pre-radio era, if you wanted to know who won the baseball game, if you wanted to know if your team was doing well in college football or high school football, how'd you find out? Well, again, you either waited for the newspaper or you got on the trolley, you headed for Brockton, you headed for Boston, and you ended up in Newspaper Row. Newspaper Row was a part of Boston on Washington Street. Every city's got a Washington Street. I know we do, but everybody else does. I'm from Quincy, we've got one. But what Newspaper Row was, see all those newspaper headlines that I put out ahead of my talk, which showed how, you know, the Boston American, the Boston Post, the Boston Traveler, the Boston Herald, the Boston... There were 9 newspapers in Boston at that time, all slugging it out. And just about all of them were located on the same street, within footprints of each other, okay? And what they would do is they would put out a chalkboard. And they would have one of the reporters, when the reports came in of the big stories, they had a telegraph wire, and somebody would get in the Morse code messages, or they had telephone. The Boston Globe was one of the first to use telephone, but not every city had it in wide use. But they would use those 2 things to get the news, and then they'd bring it down to the chalkboard and write the headlines on the chalkboard. And you would just go from newspaper to newspaper to newspaper, finding out what the score was or what the whatever you were interested in. And so there's a very good chance that with a story like the Molasses flood, you, if you could, got to Boston because you wanted to know what was going on, and that's where it was going on. Now, the chances are the police kind of kept you away, so Newspaper Row might not have done you a lot of good. But in general, in the days that followed, gathering on Washington Street in front of all the newspapers, it was almost kind of like a giant extended family, a camaraderie. People would just kind of like, you know, did you hear anything? Oh my God, you know, they'd see the reporters going by. Is there any news? Is there any news? And they'd wait until the guy on the... During the baseball season, they'd have someone who was jokingly called Megaphone Man. And Megaphone Man would megaphone the play-by-play. They'd get the, you know, the balls and the strikes on the telegraph, and then they'd be just like, you know, and the Red Sox are leading 2-1, it's the bottom of the 7th, and people would just be standing there like, nobody had an expectation of anything different, okay? When the Molasses flood happened, several things occurred simultaneously. For one thing, it was spread, the story was spread all over the United States. This was not just a Boston story. I have found mentions of the Molasses flood in newspapers as far away as Oakland, California, okay? As tiny as, you know, Bay City, Michigan, okay? No offense to Bay City. If you're watching, you know, I've been there, you're a great place. But compared to Oakland, California, you were kind of smaller. My point is, it didn't matter where you were in January of 1919. Because the wire services, like the Associated Press, which is still around, sent the story out by telegraph to anyone that wanted it within hours, that story was moving, and it was moving all across the country. You may say, okay, it's a news story, it moved. Yeah, but what also moved was a little bit of a question, namely, how did it happen? How many people were killed? Who done it? Because, of course, it was an era just like today of conspiracy theories. I think the anarchists did it. You know? Well, I think it was the Democrats. No, it was the Republicans. You know? I mean, we had people that, in the absence of facts, were just kind of providing their own. Does this sound familiar? Yeah, there's nothing new under the sun, okay? Conspiracy theories were all over everywhere. And some of them possibly spread through the people in Newspaper Row, but more likely not, because they were getting the information right from the reporters. Problem, the reporters didn't have all the information, okay? So, how many people got killed? You notice one headline, 30 dead in Molasses. You notice another headline, 11 dead, 6, 9, do I hear 12? As people are trying to get their facts in, they want to get it first, just like today with the internet, okay? I always tell my students, there's a rule in journalism, early reporting is always wrong, okay? Now, it's not usually wrong intentionally. It's wrong because you don't have all the information, okay? Case in point, remember the Oklahoma City bombing? What was the first report? Oh my God, it was like dark-skinned people in a van. No, there were no dark-skinned people in a van. There were a couple of people wandering through town who kind of got pulled over, but they had nothing to do with it. By the time they got around to Timothy McVeigh, who was far from a dark-skinned person in a van, the story had morphed exponentially with every network and every newspaper basically engaging in speculation. Okay, it was educated speculation, but my point is, even back then, with fewer resources, speculation was the national pastime. And in the case of the Molasses flood, people were dying to know not just how many people were injured or how many people were deceased. How could this happen? Because Boston was supposed to be this enlightened city. I mean, you've read the book. Dark Tide is a wonderful book, and I can't say enough good things about it from the point of view of history. It really does get to the heart of the matter, and everyone should read it. But also, back then, people were in the midst of the story, so they didn't quite know what to make of it, and they were really counting on print to tell them what was going on. But now let's move to Whitman for a second. What else were they doing? Well, as it turns out, one of the big things in the United States in 1919 was amateur radio, ham radio. We don't have commercial radio yet, okay? We won't for another few months. By the way, it's a myth that KDKA in Pittsburgh was the first station, pick one, in the world, in the universe, on the planet. None of that's true. KDKA had a wonderful publicity department. Boy, howdy, did they have a wonderful publicity department. The reality is, we will never know who the first radio station was, but there's a real good chance that one of the first was right here in the greater Boston area, a little station called 1XE, and it was on the campus of Tufts. It was in Medford Hillside. It wasn't a college station, it was just on the campus of. They rented a building and a number of the people were grads. But the X, 1XE, they were experimental. Early radio was considered an experiment, okay? Nobody knew it was going to happen. People did the same with television. Oh, who's going to watch furniture that talks? Well, I suppose at the time it did, that real quote, not a fake quote. Same thing with radio. It was like, why would people want to stop talking to each other to listen to the radio? Well, because lots of people did. But at that point in time, amateur radio is starting to really take off, okay? You've heard of Marconi. You may have heard of Reginald Fessenden, who is arguably the first person to broadcast voice and music. You'll see on the internet that supposedly he did it on Christmas Eve, 1906. Nah, lovely story. I like it a lot. Promoted by his wife, basically. God rest her soul. She loved the guy. She wanted to make sure he was remembered. I think I just touched the mic. I'm sorry. I apologize. The problem with the 1906 story, it already happened probably a few months before that, but Christmas Eve sounds so much more glamorous, don't you think? They were following the star, and they heard voice and music, and not exactly. But the fact is, though, that what Fessenden did changed everything. Because up until that point, Morse code. If you didn't know it, you couldn't do very much. But once you could broadcast voice, once you could broadcast music if you wanted to, suddenly a whole bunch of what came to be called boy engineers spring up, okay? Why boy engineers? Well, as it turns out, there's a few girls, but by and large, it was a hobby for young boys. They built their own sets. They, they got the stuff at an electric shop. They did all these cool things, and they strung it together. It looked awful, but you could broadcast with it. And I found that just about every city, including Whitman, had a number of these young boys who were, for the most part, teens. 13, 14, 15, and they had heard about this cool thing called wireless telephone, where you could like broadcast. And now there's no radio yet as we know it, but there sure is this stuff where you can broadcast in your own little ham shack. And I found that Whitman had several of these young men, these boy engineers. I found out who they were, and I wonder if any of their living relatives are still in town. Because when I do this kind of research, people are often like, wow, that was my grandfather, or my great-great-grandfather, or in some cases, that was my grandma. You know, you just never know. So Dwight Blanchard, okay, he was 15 years old in 1919. He was a ham radio operator with the call letters 1HZ. The 1 stood for New England. Okay, if you see early, if you're going through somebody's attic and you find they had a ham radio license, the first number will tell you where they were from. Okay, so in the case of Massachusetts and other New England areas, it's always a 1. Remember I told you about our first radio station, little 1XE? Yeah, that's what the 1 was for. Okay, so Dwight Blanchard, he's 15 years old, and there's a really good chance that he's relaying information about the Molasses flood, because why wouldn't he? This is what hams were supposed to do. The American Radio Relay League, one of the big organizations for ham radio, got started for that very purpose. Hams were famous in that pre-radio era, and even to this day in some rural parts of the world, they were famous for relaying information, sometimes to the newspapers, sometimes to the public, sometimes to other hams, but this is one way you would have kept informed. And I have pictures in my mind of Dwight Blanchard. He was living on Whitman Street. His father's name was Stanley. His father was in the shoe biz. He was a superintendent at a shoe factory. Didn't know from any of this, but all of these young boys, they're fascinated by this, and Dwight is one of them. Later on, Dwight goes on to go into this for a living. He becomes an electrical engineer, okay? And then there was Lewis Fullerton. He lived on Willard Avenue. He was 18 in 1919. His ham call letters were 1KY. His father was a florist, later a gardener, but I'm telling you this just because there was nobody in the family to apprentice these boys into the occupation. It was just, wow, here's a cool new technology. And as we find even today, who are the early adopters with new technology? It's very often teens, both boys and girls today, because it's not necessary to have a background in engineering. But the reality is, a lot of people, even back then, it's like, wow, amateur radio? You could broadcast like voice and music? Really? There was a radio station on a campus in San Jose, and they're like playing requests? Cool. Yeah, 1912. So here we have in Whitman, we got Dwight Blanchard, we got Lewis Fullerton. Now, in the 1922 city directory, Lewis identifies himself as a radio operator. What does that mean? Well, generally what that means is, in the early days of radio, you had to have somebody install your radio for you, okay? In fact, let me show you something. Radio in its early days was very homemade, very difficult to use. Here's an ad from Radio News magazine from 1923. Let's see if you can read it. And when I say let's see if you can read it, I don't mean can you read the words. I mean, what's the meaning of this ad? So up until 1923, you want a radio, you build your own. It's got diagrams and blueprints, and it's complicated, and this and that. As a result, pretty much only boy engineers and a few girl engineers are doing it. But by 1923, they're starting to mass produce radios. You can buy one in a store. You can't in Whitman. There's nobody that's selling them. You have to go to Abington or you have to go to Brockton, okay? But people are. They're advertising in the city directory. You want to get a radio? Our store has them. So what's this ad say? Well, of course, even back then in 1923, you got to have your attractive female, okay? So you got your attractive female. And what's she doing? She's tuning her radio. From whence the expression, stay tuned. okay, because signals came in, came out, they faded, they had static, and you hoped they would stay tuned, which is kind of amusing. I mean, we still have the expression, even though it's been years since we used that technology, but there you go. But check this out. What's she doing? She's tuning her radio. She's smiling because this radio is so easy to use that even a woman can do it. But, you know, we can't get ahead of ourselves. It's, you know, the early 20s and etc. But I found that interesting, okay? Because, again, we're still negotiating the meaning here. What does any of this mean? So, back to our boy engineers, okay? Just let me give you a couple more, because a couple of them actually had pretty interesting stories based on what I found, okay? I also found Harold Johnson. He lived on Broad Street. He was 16 years old in 1919. His ham call was 1QM. His father was James, worked in a shoe factory, and Harold, too, went on to a career as a radio engineer. Finally, and this guy really fascinated me, Everett J. Colson lived on Court Street. He didn't really seem to become a ham until the mid-1920s, even though he wrote to the Boston Globe relentlessly with questions about how to build ham radio sets. But he came from a really interesting family. His father was, as many people in town were, a shoemaker. What's interesting about that? In 1919, he runs for the Massachusetts state legislature, and he wins. His father, Frank Colson, was a legislator from 1919 to 1922. And his son Everett, like I said, went on to become not just a ham radio operator and a boy engineer. He goes on to work for Westinghouse. Moves to Springfield, works at the Westinghouse factory, ultimately works for AT&T. So these boy engineers end up going from Whitman to having a major career in the industry. But may I skip for 1 second? Who's the most famous person from Whitman who was involved with radio? Do you know? Because I didn't either. And not because I never think about Whitman, because I do think about Whitman, because right next door to you guys in Abington lived a person who was a major part of my childhood. A guy by the name of Big Brother Bob Emery. Yeah, Big Brother grew up in Abington. Okay. Yeah, got a picture. Got a picture. Okay, we'll talk about him later. But as it turns out, while the boy engineers helped people in Whitman get information, probably from the Boston newspapers or anybody else they could get information from, there's somebody else in town who's growing up here and who's going to go on to become internationally famous, not for radio, although radio is going to help him expand his public profile. His first name is Frank, although later you'll know him as Francis. Cardinal Spellman. Yeah, Cardinal Spellman's father, William, is a grocer. Cardinal Spellman, who at that time is just Frank Spellman, grows up in Whitman, goes to Whitman High School, ultimately goes off and goes for the priesthood. You may say, Donna, what's this got to do with radio? Radio did change everything. So at that point, he's a Monsignor, and the Vatican gets a radio station. Okay? And the Vatican gets a radio station, which I believe was called HJV. It was a shortwave station. But the networks are fascinated by the opportunity of hearing, for the first time, the voice of the Pope. Because this is how radio changes things. Up until 1920, you want to know about the Molasses flood, you want to know about anything, you're waiting for the newspaper to come out. Even if the boy engineers got you the story first, you're still waiting. But who's telling the story? You have to know how to read it. But what if you can't read it? What if you're an immigrant? What if you're sort of illiterate? There's a lot of farmers in Abington. Big Brother Bob Emery's dad, James, was a farmer. Okay, he was several other things as well, but he had a farm. Now, I'm not saying farmers are ignorant. I'm not saying that at all. But I am saying that for a lot of people, reading the newspaper was very problematic, particularly for immigrants. And this really excluded a lot of people. So how does radio change things? Not only can you learn about the news as it's happening, first mass medium to take you to an event as it's happening. The Molasses flood, they put out 5, 6, 7, 8 editions of the paper covering that story. But you still had to wait until they came out. Today, how would we be covering that story? Okay, here's Ron Mott of NBC on the scene, and there's David Muir of Channel 5 on the scene, and you know, you'd have everybody there, oh yeah, we're flying in Diane Sawyer. She's retired, but we're getting her out of retirement, flying her in there. Everybody would parachute in and report on the story, and then they'd parachute back out again. Today, we have an expectation of instant news coverage. Back then, they didn't. And then radio comes along, and suddenly, you're getting taken to the event as it's happening, and you're hearing the voices of the actual newsmakers, okay? So the Pope is a newsmaker, let's be honest. The church is very powerful in the early 1900s. I'm not saying it's not today, but back then, if the Pope issued a pronouncement, there were an awful lot of people that kind of stopped what they were doing and just, you know. So the Pope decides to go on his shortwave radio station and give a talk about, interestingly enough, workers' rights. And he gives it in 3 languages. None of them happen to be English, okay? But that's where our friend Monsignor Spellman comes in, who's a linguist, and who translates the Pope and goes on the American networks, NBC and CBS at that time. There's no ABC yet, but it's 1931. And this is Monsignor Spellman's introduction to the wider audience. He goes on the radio and he explains and translates what the Pope just said and what the implications of it are. And people are like, oh my God, is there this much wonderfulness in the world? I not only got to hear the Pope, but now I'm hearing our hometown guy. You know, I remember him. I know his father. I mean, everybody knew him, okay? And suddenly, Monsignor Spellman's voice is being heard from coast to coast. Turns out he's a really good radio speaker, okay? And this is an art, okay? Because a lot of the people that were on the radio, boy, they were not very good speakers at all. Just like later television is going to destroy, some of you may remember reading about the Kennedy-Nixon debate, where Kennedy, in 1960, Kennedy looks young and strong and handsome. Nixon, no offense, kind of looks like a weasel. And he looked shifty. Now, today we know he had checked himself out of a hospital against doctor's orders, but he also was not comfortable on television. He just wasn't. It was a new mass medium. He was not comfortable with it, and he looked uncomfortable. He didn't know which camera to look at. Kennedy hired a coach. He practiced. He treated it like it was a sporting event. You know, tell me if I'm doing this right, you know? And as a result, he looked confident. Interesting point, and you can look this up. The people that listened to the debate thought Nixon had won because Nixon had the better policy proposals and ideas. Kennedy sounded good, but there was nothing there, if you know what I'm saying. But the people that watched it on TV, oh my God, he was handsome, he was vibrant, he was confident, he was all of these things. And many people think that's what swung the debate for him, okay? So in radio, getting on the air was one thing. Being a good speaker, something else entirely. And the Monsignor had what it took. Coolidge was awful. Okay, by the way, it's a myth that Calvin Coolidge was Silent Cal. Total myth. Calvin Coolidge was on the radio relentlessly, okay? I found tons of times Coolidge was on the radio, but he had an awful radio voice, and he knew it. And he started just joking about, I know I've got a really nasally voice, but you know, I'm the president, what can you do? You know, but he had fun with it. The fact is, though, that suddenly you had to be able to campaign by radio. You didn't have to do that before. Today, you know, if there's a molasses flood, you've got the play-by-play. Back then, either you read it or you waited for someone to explain it. But now in the 1920s, everything is changing because everything is about, can you describe it? Can you explain it? Are you at the event? And the Monsignor took people in their mind, took them to the Vatican. He explained, he described what the Pope was wearing. He described the pomp and the ceremony. I've read, okay, granted, I'm Jewish, so it doesn't mean to me what it would to Catholics, but as a student of radio, I read the comments the next day from people of all religions, and they were like, wow, hire this guy. You know, I mean, he can explain anything to anyone. And pretty soon he became kind of the official spokesperson to the American audiences for the Vatican. And I suggest to you that it is probably not accidental that not too much longer after that, not too much longer, 1932, he's on the air in 31, getting great reviews. By 32, he's named Auxiliary Bishop of Boston. Okay? He gets moved to New York in 1939 to be Archbishop of New York. He's a cardinal in 46, and he continues to use broadcasting as a way to get the message out. So this is something that really, really changes. But let's go back again for a second, okay? So we got Frank Colson, and he becomes a state legislator for 3 years. Where else might you have heard the news back then? Bless you, by the way, there's allergy stuff going on out there. It's brutal. But Auntie Donna has cough drops if you need them, okay? And lollipops. So where else might you have heard the news back then? 1919, 1920, right on the edge of going over all print to print and radio. Where else?
Did they do it in the movies as early as that?
Thank you. Absolutely. There are, from 1911 on, there's newsreels. You may say, how'd they do newsreels? It was like silent. Except that's kind of a misnomer too. Just like the myth of KDKA being the first radio station on the planet, it's also a myth that movies were silent. Movies didn't necessarily have talking. The problem being the technology still hadn't matched up the sound with people's lips moving, saying, oh, I know singing a chipmunk, and it was really difficult because they couldn't understand a word they were saying. So since they couldn't perfect it until about 1926, they just basically, but that doesn't mean they didn't have sound effects. That doesn't mean they didn't have a piano player. Some of you may remember the classic rock album by Elton John, Don't Shoot Me, I'm Only the Piano Player. That's actually based on reality, not to Elton John. He lived years after that. But people would go to a movie. They didn't like the movie. The only real live person in the theater was the poor piano player, you know, who's doing the sound effects and doing the drum and doing the, you know, and very often people would be like, this is the worst movie I've ever heard, you know, and they'd go after the poor piano player. So the reality was that there were some newsreels. Now, bless you, they came from other cities. I'm sure somebody did something with the Molasses flood because it was just such a huge story. Okay, so you may very well have gone to the movie theater, which in Whitman at that time is the Empire Theater, located 652 Washington and West Streets. Okay, I doubt that anything like that is there now. One of my big complaints in life is the fact that so much of our media history is gone. We don't preserve it. We don't put up a plaque. We don't put up in anything. Okay, I mean, the first radio station on the campus at Medford Hills, gone, burned down in a fire in 1972. It lives in a few pieces of information in the Tufts College archives and stuff that people like me have collected over the years, like rare photographs and so on and so on. But if there's like one central location of any of that stuff, nowhere. And that's common. That happens so much. So much of what we grew up listening to, gone. Do you know how few tapes of Big Brother Bob Emery there are still left in existence? Good luck finding one, okay? Because again, it never occurred to anybody that, wow, this stuff's important, we should keep it. One of the good things about print journalism is it provided a lasting record. Okay, granted, it was a static record, like there it was, okay? But at least it was a record. So much of early broadcasting exists nowhere. It exists either if it was mentioned in a magazine or if it was mentioned in a newspaper. And think about this for a second. Some newspapers didn't mention broadcasting. How come?
Competition.
Absolutely. Okay? Now, we were lucky in Greater Boston. The Boston American, which was a Hearst paper, and I know a lot of people think Scandal because they were known for being a scandal sheet, but Hearst was also no dummy. And he saw the future, and he knew that you either embrace it or you get run over by it. And he decided he'd embrace it. So he made an agreement with Little 1XE on Medford Hillside, which later was renamed WGI. He made an agreement with them where American reporters, Boston American reporters, were doing news on WGI in February of 1922. That early, okay, with some of the earliest newscasts. Problem? We've got none of them. But the fact is, at least we have mention of them. But I would have loved to hear what they sounded like. Now, years later, my cultural hero, the late great Eunice Randall, who was the first woman announcer in New England and possibly in the eastern United States. I've got her on the radio as early as 1919, okay? She did a recreation, and I have it, and I will send it to you as an audio file if you ever want to hear it. She did a recreation of what one of her newscasts sounded like. But they did stolen car reports. They did all stuff that today we'd be like, that's news? But people were just fascinated by it all. So there you go. So yeah, you might have gone to the theater, and if the Empire Theater had a leased wire, they might have, by telegraph, found out what the latest news was, or by telephone, and then had someone up on the stage to announce it. We know that a number of theaters did that with the World Series. Absolutely, okay? Particularly if the Red Sox were in it, okay? We've found all kinds of evidence of theaters making an agreement to sort of broadcast the game. But if we're talking broadcasting, I wouldn't be doing my job if I didn't do a shout out to... There he is.
Oh.
Exactly. The Red Sox didn't know. And I can understand. That's Gus Rooney. You've never heard of them. You've never heard of Gus. But that's okay, because Gus has probably never heard of you. But Gus Rooney was the first person that we know about to broadcast a Red Sox game back in 1926. In fact, this is a publicity photo that the Red Sox and the radio station doing it, which was WNAC, still around. Today you know it as WRKO, okay? But WNAC, which was owned by the late great John Shepard III of the Shepard Department Stores, also long gone, but he hired Gus to do play-by-play of the Red Sox game in April of 1926. Gus was a print journalist. He worked for the Boston Traveler. He was a sports writer. And Shepard basically, I mean, there's no broadcasters to do baseball yet. I mean, it's not an occupation yet. Radio's still new. But he basically wanders around the newsroom at the Boston Traveler and says, anybody want to make a few bucks? And of course, every hand went up. And he said, you know, would you like to broadcast the game? And Gus said, sure, can't be that difficult. Poor Gus. The game went 16 innings. And there was no color guy, no staff, you know, by color, I mean somebody to do the, you know, well, gee, Bob, what do you think about that play? Oh, I don't know, Charlie, you know, back to you, Susan. None of that. It was Gus. And if poor Gus had to use the restroom, it was like, good luck with that. Okay, everything was live. There was no way to tape it. Poor baby. He couldn't speak for like 2.5 weeks. He had such laryngitis after that. 16 innings. Oy. But the public loved it. And it ended up with the Red Sox hiring people to do the broadcasts full time. So yeah, the idea of having someone there to tell you about it was just a really great thing. So what else changes? Let's talk about what else changes. I want to circle back to the molasses fire for a second if I could. The big debate about the molasses flood, I think I called it a fire, I'm so sorry, the molasses flood, the big debate was what to call it. Was it a tragedy? Was it a catastrophe? One newspaper said it was the worst thing that's ever happened. Really? Okay, like we've had this thing called the Civil War. Okay, we just got done with the First World War. Nope, that's got to have a little hyperbole. But there really was a big debate about what to call this thing. And there were, you know, a number of people trying to figure out what would be the correct way to talk about it. And as I said, the other thing was how many people died, how many people were injured, what's the accurate news. But this is a good thing for one person, okay? This is a really good thing for the mayor of Boston. Because up until that point, the mayor of Boston, a guy by the name of Andrew J. Peters, he's about to kind of be investigated for corruption. Interesting fellow. Now, I know you're shocked to find corruption in politics. I'm so glad we've gotten rid of that. I mean, we're all just, you know, it's all good now. You know, everything is fine. Now, Peters had succeeded, speaking of corrupt politicians, he had succeeded James Michael Curley. Now, of course, we haven't heard the end of Curley. He'll be back. He always is. But Peters campaigned on, you know, good government, clean up the mess in Boston, blah, blah, blah. And it turns out he had a mistress. It turned out he had, you know, his hand in the till about various other things. Thanks to the molasses flood, nobody's talking about him anymore. It's like, who's he? They're busy. And he can, of course, get out there to the newspapers, and he's shocked to find molasses floods going on, and he's going to get to the bottom of it immediately. And, of course, he didn't get to the bottom of it immediately, but that's okay. But he got in the news a lot, and that's, you know, for something other than, does he really have a mistress? You know? Oh, the good old days. We were just so much less corrupt back then, right? But what else gets knocked off the front page? What's the other big news story that the molasses flood completely, it becomes the central story for days? Prohibition. Prohibition is in the news. And that's a really controversial issue, okay? What's up with prohibition? We're moving closer and closer and closer to banning all alcohol. Okay, some people are for it, some people are against it, but they were debating it on the front pages of the newspaper till this, okay? What else is in the news? Well, the other things that are going on are, of course, the drive to ratify the amendment that'll give women the right to vote. New York votes for suffrage for women. By the way, you know where the word suffrage comes from? A lot of my students have never heard the word, and they think it relates to suffer, like in suffer the little children to come unto me, like in the King James Version. Suffrage, of course, is an old word meaning permission. When Jesus said, suffer the little children, according to the King James translation, he was saying, permit, allow the children to come to me. So women's suffrage was permission, give them permission to vote, allow them to vote. And the people that were fighting for it had just picked up a couple more states. They were getting closer and closer to the thing getting ratified, and not in Boston, okay? Because everybody was talking about the molasses flood. But Steve Puleo raises a very interesting question. Why did this event not become an event that for the most part has stayed in the national memory? Because it didn't. It had its couple of weeks, it had its bunch of conspiracy theories, and then what? On to the next thing. And fortunately for us, he wrote that book, so we can kind of revisit it. But there was just something that didn't stay with people. And I myself am as puzzled as he is, because you would have thought it would have stayed with people. I mean, there's certain events like the Titanic, everybody thinks about the Kennedy-Nixon debate, these are like touchstones in history. The molasses flood was very, very important for a while, and then what? it just fades out of the national memory. And as I said, I'm very glad as a historian that that book was written, because it really does bring us back to why these things happened and why these things could happen again, okay? Look at the Santayana. Forgive me for jumping for a second, but George Santayana, the philosopher, he really did say, if you don't learn from the mistakes of the past, you'll repeat them in the future, or some version of that. There's a lot of fake quotes on the internet. That doesn't happen to be one of them. He really, in 1896, he really did say something about the importance of remembering the past so that you won't repeat stuff in the future. Have we learned from the mistakes of the past? Not as far as I can. I mean, look at the Station nightclub. Okay? In 100 people died. Coconut Grove.
Yes.
400 and what? 492, you know, similar, you know, to overcrowding, corruption, inspectors who didn't inspect, etc., etc. What did we learn? So what did we learn from the Molasses flood? We certainly learned that in one of the final stories of the pre-radio era, print journalism really did distinguish themselves. They really did get out there, and they self-corrected, okay? There were big issues about how many people got killed and how many people got injured, and the number was in flux for days. But by and large, good journalism won out. The results were pretty accurate. We did kind of find out what happened, and then we all moved on. And then along came radio. And today, of course, we're living in the television and internet world. It's a much more multimedia world. But I must tell you, I rely on print journalism a lot. I love print journalism. I admire print journalism. And I really do believe that print journalism is so important in a culture. And I would feel terrible if there were no more print journalism, because it really does provide us with the rough draft of history, that first draft of history. So a couple more things, and then I'll take questions, because I don't want to take up large amounts of your time. One thing from Whitman that's kind of interesting in terms of broadcasting is one of the things that Whitman becomes known for, in addition to having a Monsignor who becomes a cardinal, Whitman becomes known for regal shoes. Now, regal shoes becomes this major force in the shoe business, such that it has stores all over everywhere, not just in New England. I saw ads for Regal shoes in the New York Times. I saw ads for Regal shoes in the Oakland newspapers. I mean, I keep coming back to Oakland, but for me that's like coast to coast, okay? And what's interesting about Regal shoes is they also embraced the future. They started off basically with print. You know, we're the best, most stylish, most fancy shoes. I mean, beautiful designer shoes for, wait for it, $7. You can't get a handkerchief today for $7. But there they are with these, and for men and women, I mean, just classy shoes. Factory was in Whitman. And they embraced radio in the early 1930s and became sponsor of CBS radio programs. So there you go. Let's talk networks for a second, if I may. Regal shoes. I haven't been able to find, and I'd like to, whether Whitman High had a marching band back in those days. Because in the early days of radio, radio was live, okay? We don't really get any way to record stuff easily till the mid to late 1930s. There is a way to transcribe broadcasts as early as 1929. But it's expensive, it's cumbersome, you have to go to a studio, it takes a special disc. Most stations are like, not interested. And so most stations, it's all live. In fact, here we have, for your listening and dancing pleasure, the WBZ players. You've never heard of any of them. One of them's the receptionist, one of them is, you know, the sales manager. Basically, part of working at any radio station in the 1920s, you volunteered, or rather you got volunteered, okay? And they put on live plays, they put on live singing, I mentioned to you my cultural hero, Eunice Randall, the first woman announcer. Eunice not only was an announcer, she also was a singer. Not because she wanted to be, but because radio was live, so if your guest didn't show up, you and the engineer started singing. And she would literally sing duets with one of the engineers. It was hilarious. I've heard a couple of them. I hope she didn't give up her day job. But you know what? People had no expectation back then. So it was kind of like, wow, they're singing. That's kind of cool, you know? The other thing that was interesting about live radio is you never knew what was going to happen. You never knew who's going to show up, who's not going to show up. The early studios are not real pretty. They're not real aesthetic. They got wires dangling. They look pretty dangerous, actually. Westinghouse is one of the first companies to realize we better have nice studios if we want to get the guests in here. And gradually they start getting some really famous people on the air. Now think about this. There you are sitting in your house in Whitman, and you're listening to your little radio. Oh, in 1924, what are you listening to? You're listening to a little station in Bridgewater. Yeah, one of the forgotten stories of early radio was the fact that anyone could start a radio station, okay? There was no FCC yet. There was no anything, okay? It was kind of like the wild, wild west, kind of like the early days of the internet. And a lot of young entrepreneurs with a heart who just wished they could be on the air decided to go on the air. And so it was in 1924 that three guys from Bridgewater, and I'm blocking on the name of one of them, but I do remember the other two. One of them was a guy named Harry Cyranosian, and the other one was a guy named Leo Wilbur. And you know that as soon as I leave, I will remember the third one, because ain't that always the way, okay? But they just started this little station. They could only afford to keep it on the air a couple of days a week for a couple of hours. Okay, it was on the air Fridays and Sundays for about 2 hours, okay? But luckily for all of us, one of the days that they were on the air, there was a fire in downtown Bridgewater. And the little radio station that could, WFBN, broadcast about the fire. They said something about it. They said, oh my God, we're like looking out our window and we see smoke. And now we see flames. And the fire department, which had been listening to the station because they liked the music, they came running. And I'm not making this up. This is not an urban legend. You can read about this in the Bridgewater Independent, which covered the story. They had been ignoring the station since the day it went on the air. But suddenly it saved some lives because it was like downtown was about to go up in a blaze and the candy store was on fire and all this other. They saved lives. They got the fire department there because the fire department was listening to this little local station. Unfortunately, goodwill and lots of attaboys wasn't enough to come up with funding for the station, and in October of 1925 it left the air. But you will find stories like that all over Massachusetts of little local stations that have their 15 minutes, have some fun, promote, so hold my calls, I can't go anywhere. It's just, I'll sign autographs later, okay? No, this is the new world we live in too, you know? I'm always interested in what people's ringtones are. Can you tell something about people by their ringtones?
Yeah, I wonder.
I don't know. Mine is Little Brown Dog. Little Brown Dog is a folk song played on the guitar by a folk guitarist named Dick Rossmini. Long gone, long forgotten. But when I was a kid growing up, I loved folk music. And I can't play the guitar, okay? Years later, we know why. I have something in the lupus family. But back then, nobody could diagnose it. I just knew that I couldn't do it. And he was this incredible local guitarist, and he was on the radio on WBZ, and he had an album on Elektra Records, and one of the songs he played was Little Brown Dog. And it's a great little song. And so I decided, because that's what I used when I first went on the radio myself, I used that as my theme song. I said, fine, I'll use it as my ringtone. Nobody knows what it is. But, you know, keeping Dick Rossmini alive. Oh, that's the thing I love about radio. Radio brings back the dead. It brings them back to life. Because phonograph records did exist, okay? And because of phonograph records, which radio generally played live music, But some stations did play phonograph records. One of the things I found at a yard sale was I found some playlists that actually talked about like what songs were played that night. And it was just fascinating to me to look at these records, you know? So yeah, the great Caruso died, I think in 1921. As far as I know, he is still dead. But on the radio, he lived because they got his records. And people who didn't know he died, we see this even today with people listening to the late John Lennon and their kids and they don't know. And they're like, wow, where can I, you know, where is he performing? In the heavenly choir, perhaps, because, you know, but this is one of the interesting things about radio. So what I wanted to do in my talk, and I hope I'm halfway interesting, but what I wanted to do was to talk about how in the era of the Molasses flood, society was changing. People are starting to have a new option for getting their news. They're starting to have a new option for hearing the newsmakers speaking directly to them. Local people are getting on the air and becoming stars for the first time. I talked to you about the Monsignor. Let me give you somebody from, here's one of the people I dearly love, and not because he's a rabbi. This is Harry Levy. You may say, so what, Donna? Well, yeah, that was exactly the point. There was a rule in early radio that every station had to have a clergy person give an inspirational reading. It wasn't like a government rule. It was just sort of like it was a religious time. It was a religious space. And, okay, you know, on Sunday, we need a clergy person. It was usually a man, but there were some women clergy. Yes, there were, and I have found them on the radio, absolutely. But anyway, so Rabbi Levy, that's, if you're taking notes, it's L-E-V-I. Rabbi Levy was the rabbi of Temple Israel in Boston, humongous temple, okay? His congregation says, hey, they got nothing but priests and ministers on the air, not that there's anything wrong with that, but why don't you apply? I mean, why don't you let them know that you could give an inspirational sermon? Come on, you're pretty inspirational. So Rabbi Levy goes down to WNAC, which is the station that is doing the inspirational messages, and basically volunteers. And he gets on the air and does so well that people start asking him to come back. He becomes jokingly known as the radio rabbi, okay? And we find a very interesting article about him in the Boston Evening Transcript, which is the newspaper of the upper-class elite white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, the Boston Brahmins, okay? He becomes so well known in Boston that they do a profile about him and they survey his congregation and they find that 20% of them aren't Jewish. Why are they there? Because they heard him on the radio and they want his autograph. Okay? He had to issue 2 books of his sermons. He became so beloved in Boston. Okay? Now, that's cute, but in a way it also was interesting because as it turns out, who's Rabbi Levy's closest friend? A priest. And who's his other close friend? A minister. This sounds like a joke, but it isn't. He was a big believer in ecumenism, okay? And his friend, Father Michael J. Ahern, who was a Catholic priest, they'd been friends for ages. They'd been on panels together. Father Ahern was like way ahead of his time about a lot of things, okay? And the two of them started going out and doing like little seminars because they were both on the radio. And then they got a minister. They had several ministers. One of them was Henry Knox Sherrill. Reverend Sherrill, there's a building named after him at Lesley University, and when I told them like who he was, they thought that was kind of cool. But yeah, this is like, it sounds like a joke. A priest, a rabbi, and a minister, except here's the rabbi, I've got a picture of the priest, and I've got a picture of the minister. And they would go out to events at a very bigoted time in American history, a time when the Ku Klux Klan marched in Washington and got like 25,000 people marching with them. But they took it on by just going from school to school, from civic organization to civic organization, and teaching tolerance. And the fact that you could hear a rabbi on the radio at a time when there was no ecumenism, when there was no official policy, for many people it was like, wow, he sounds kind of normal. Now, we can laugh at that, except if you've been taught all kinds of bad stuff about them, and then suddenly them is telling you this nice Bible story, and them is giving you this really nice sermon, and you can go to the synagogue and meet them, and it just demythologizes the whole thing. So this is another wonderful thing that radio did.
What year are we talking?
Rabbi Levi went on the radio for the first time in 1923. By 1924, he is a regular. He's on the air twice a month, and they even have to set up live synagogue services from Temple Israel because the public demanded it. Okay, but there was a curiosity. It wasn't like, oh my God, everybody wants to convert. No, it was more along the lines of, wow, never been in a synagogue before. They told us we can't go. Okay, before Vatican II, don't forget, there were rules in the church that said you couldn't go into a synagogue. There were rules that said you couldn't go to a Jewish wedding, etc., etc. But now suddenly, there they were, coming right into your room, just talking to you. And it really, in a small way, I think it contributed to tolerance in Boston. Rabbi Levi became the go-to person for the newspapers, okay? Whenever the newspapers needed someone to talk about Catholic stuff, they all went to the Monsignor, okay? Later Cardinal Spellman when he was still in Boston. But when they wanted something local, they'd go to Father Ahern because he was around. He lived in Weston, then he worked in Boston. And when they wanted to know something about the Jews or about Judaism, Rabbi Levi. So he became kind of the go-to person for 2 decades, just explaining the stuff. And it really made a difference. But this again, you know, we hear about all the bad things the media did. We heard about the scandal. We heard about all these terrible things. But what we don't hear about is how these media changed people's lives. How gathering on Newspaper Row gave people a sense of friendship and camaraderie when the Red Sox were winning or even when they were losing. How finding out things and just waiting for the reporters, you felt informed. Radio did that too. I hold in my hand, talk about stuff you found at a flea market. This is a diary. This is a diary, and it's a radio diary. I don't know whose diary it is, but radio was so important to people in that era, in the early 1920s, that people literally kept diaries of what stations they listened to, who was on, what they thought of it, etc., and etc. And I have one, okay? And these are the kinds of things, this was going to get tossed, gone forever. But what I'm up to is preserving it, because this is the history of my industry. This is the history of somebody who loved radio enough to sit and write down, date by date by date, what he or she heard and what he or she thought about it. Talk about making a difference in someone's life. Taking you to those events for the first time, coming right at you. It was a very exciting era. It really was. I'm going to stop now because too much of me can get really boring. But I'm going to stop and take questions if you have them. And as I said, I'd be delighted to send you my books. But I'm also delighted anytime I get a chance to come and talk about broadcasting. I love talking about it. I hope I've been halfway interesting. Thank you so much for having me. I love you to bits and pieces.